11 years, 11 missions, every year in business, every year coaching elite performance under pressure. Gustavo Ruthes has been running the same cycle I ran before, every mission, brief, execute, and debrief. And now the debrief has been published with 11 insights after 11 years. Last time Gustavo was a guest of the show, we talked about the foundation, why mental well-being is not a luxury, but is the landing gear. Season 1, Episode 5 of Tools of Fighter Pilots. Today we go tactical. As promised for Season 2 of Tools of Fighter Pilots, we're going to observe and dissect behaviors of elite performers in order to provide actionable tools for your life, sport, and business. We go inside the 11 insights Gustavo distilled from a decade of business and coaching work with elite performers, Olympic athletes, executives, and first responders. We're going to run each one through the cockpit, where it shows up at altitude, what it costs you when you get it wrong, and what you do need to do to fix it. This is Tools of Fighter Pilots. I am TC. Gustavo, we are clear for takeoff. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Happy to have you here again. In aviation, we use something that is called the threat matrix. Basically, before flying, we map the weather, we map the threats, we map enemy capabilities, and we map the enemy territory, and also our own aircraft limitations. The point isn't to scare yourself, is to go in with eyes open. You can counter a threat you haven't named. So Gustavo, after years of working with people under pressure, what are the threats most likely people walk into completely blind?
Well, thanks for having me, TC. Well, threats vary widely from person to person, I would say. Most of the pilots I work with, specifically in aviation, a lot of them are the elite, right? So there's a 5th gen, F-35 pilots. They don't end up there by accident, right? In many cases, the F-35 was their aircraft of choice. They earned that spot. They beat everybody else to get there, right? So the issue is not usually their ability. It's these are all highly capable people. The gap is often the non-technical skill side. And I know I'm selling my fish a little bit here. That's what my specialty. That's what I work with. But non-technical skills training, it's still developing around the world. Some programs are still in their infancy in certain air forces. Some organizations offer it, but they don't make it mandatory for the pilots. Others may not even offer at all in a structured manner. So compared to sport, at least, aviation is definitely slightly behind in how consistently they train these non-technical skills. In terms of threat, they're not always like dramatic and obvious. Sometimes they're internal. Sometimes they come from pressure, from identity, from confidence, their own self-talk. So for example, a female pilot in a male-dominated environment, right? Like aviation and specifically military aviation, may put extra pressure on herself to perform, to prove to everybody that she belongs. So that can lead to maybe, I don't know, flying more aggressively than necessary or feeling like she cannot make mistakes. So that influences her self-talk. That influences how she approaches each mission, each training set. That kind of self-talk, that kind of pressure adds unnecessary pressure to a role that's already high stress and high pressure. Look, the theme here is that stress, pressure is not really the enemy. It can actually be performance enhancing. Stress is performance enhancing. It can help you lock in, sharpen your focus. It forces you to increase your effort, increases your motivation. So those are all things that improve your performance. It makes you fly better, right? So the goal is not to eliminate pressure, contrary to what many people think. The goal is to actually prepare you well enough so that pressure helps you instead of causing you problems or hurts your performance. What pressure reveals is breakdown in your preparation. Pressure alone does not break down your performance. It reveals the gaps in your preparation. Think about it like running water down the stream, down the river. It looks for the path of least resistance, right? So pressure is like that stream. It's like the little creek or river going through the rocks and looking for cracks, looking for leaks in your preparation to show up whatever it finds a little bit of space. So preparation has to be deliberate. Not only the technical side, the technical preparation matters, of course. Nothing beats sim hours, flight hours, but the mental preparation, the non-technical skills, they matter too. And a key component of it that I keep going back to it, I think it's super, super important. In aviation, everybody gets it for the most part, but in other areas, it's overlooked, is the debriefing part, the reflection, the after the fact, the post-performance reflection. It's so important because if done properly, done, for example, when I mean properly in writing as soon as possible after performance, so you don't start to change how things actually were in your mind. Being very specific instead of vague, focus on learning instead of blame. Uh, it really helps propel you forward in your performance. It's a key component. I saw another guest of yours make a very good breakdown on how to debrief properly, and I loved how he was making parallels with how it's done in aviation, but also applied to other environments, the executive world and the corporate world and all that. I really took a lot from that. It's such an important point. Turning those lessons into better preparation for the next performance through debriefing, it's so important.
And this was insight number one of the 11th. Obviously, pressure reveals breakdowns. It's fair to say that the pressure is kind of an amplifier of certain, let's say, weaknesses or blind spots. Okay, Bill Walsh used to say you need to protect Joe Montana from the left side. So it's kind of one of the things that we need to address. And breakdown is something that in aviation, fighter aviation, we call it task saturation. We are a code word tumbleweed, where the first thing you notice, the pilot is not talking anymore because the cognitive bandwidth is completely overrun by information. So there is a countermeasure that we use, which is a checklist discipline. Is something that we bring in the air, and something that we train on the ground and we bring in the air in order to overcome the situation. But not because following checklist pilots are robots, but because the system gets overloaded. So you need something that like download that kind of stress, and it holds the kind of cognitive weight that the situation is giving you. So the briefing eliminates this ambiguity, or it should eliminate the ambiguity before the wheels are up. The checklist carries the weight of giving you clarity in the cockpit. And Gustavo, back to now inside number two, what does ambiguity looks like in your client work?
Well, in aviation is exactly everything that you said, that there's so many potential distractions in the cockpit, right? So if there are no clear, defined prioritization frameworks, decision-making frameworks in place, pilots wouldn't be able to fly, right? Wouldn't be able to handle all the information available to you. So that's sort of handled in terms of procedures in aviation. Specifically about sport, for example, where an athlete, depending on the sport, right, like a soccer player cannot bring a checklist to the field with him or something, so to keep him on task. I noticed that ambiguity comes up from conflicting priorities. So, do I make the simple play, the simple team play that maybe it's best for the team, but doesn't make me look good? Or do I make a different type of play, something that makes, it's going to show my skills, I'm going to get attention to me, it's going to look good for me, but it's not necessarily the best decision for the team or for that play. So that internal conflict in a split second decision there, that ambiguity that can delay the decision making and actually make the player miss a step or actually make the wrong choice. So those ambiguities can be fostered if the players, if the athletes, for example, they don't have very defined targets for their performance, if there is lack of clarity. Sometimes that comes from external pressure. So, for example, unclear coaching instructions. They don't really know what a coach wants them to do in certain situations, so they have to decide too much on themselves. Sometimes there is, depending on the level, the media pressure or the parents' pressure or their peers' pressure. So there's so much that can go into that affects what they're going to do in any given moment throughout the game. So if they don't have this decision framework clearly established in place, they will miss a step. They will be in a little bit of trouble. So athletes don't not only have to manage everything that's going on in the game, but also that decision making that way. So training their mind, which going back, we can call it performance psychology or non-technical skills, it becomes very, very important, right? A lot of the athletes have never trained that before. I'm sure some people have, just their personality. They're already better than others at handling pressure, at being clutch, at performing when the stakes are high. And the same goes for pilots and executives. Some people already are naturally like that. But that's something that can be improved with practice as well. There are techniques and strategies that can be undertaken that over time develop your ability to handle the situations, to handle uncertainty, decrease ambiguity, and perform at your best and show all the technical training that you have been doing, allow that to come up to the surface. Population the aviators I work with, the range is broad, right? Like so from first officers and airline captains to flight test and test pilots, flight test engineers, to the fighter pilots as well. Across that range, I think the most underestimated threat is fatigue still. Everybody's like highly capable. They know their technical ins and outs for sure, but sometimes they are so good, they're incredibly capable that they start to get away with less than perfect preparation, so to speak. So they maybe they don't rest fully from one mission to the next, from one test point to the next, and they get away with it because they're that good. But that over time, without them noticing, the performance might start to degrade or they might develop unhealthy habits that one day when those risk factors all align, it may lead to something dangerous. I
And
think
that's a silent, really a silent risk, right? Because we said you can avoid pressure because of the high stakes of the environment that you're working with. You cannot avoid fatigue. So the
right.
only way that you can work with, and as you said, the training is to recognize the symptoms in order to activate those checklists. Like, for example, in aviation, we have the term hypoxia. When pilots become hypoxic, it means that not enough oxygen is going to the brain. So this is really a cognitive impact, especially when you fly in a high altitude or the air conditioning pressurization system or the max oxygen is not working properly. You might experience this one. And all of a sudden, you are in control of everything until you are not anymore. And really, what happens? You need to recognize the symptoms and follow the checklist. I remember the one the Americans used to teach me: gang load the regulators, going oxygen 100%, full pressure, and then descent. Mental fatigue is basically hypoxia for the brain. Gustavo, how do you help people to detect it before it becomes really a threat, a life threat situation?
Well, the more relevant information that you have, the better your decision making around that to mitigate those threats, that fatigue in this case. The more information you have, the better it would be your decision making. So that includes information, as much information as you can about the environment, the task at hand, the aircraft, the mission set. But a key component is knowing yourself. The more information you have about yourself, the better. So learning about yourself matters. Tools that can help, you can go super high tech and look into, sleep trackers, the Oura ring and HRV monitors and all these wearables. Those are all things that can be useful, but they're very good. And sleep trackers, for example, very good at tracking heart rate, HRV, sleep duration, general recovery trends. They're not so good yet, though, at sleep cycles. As even though they advertise as, check how much REM sleep you got or how much deep sleep you got and everything. There's significant disparity between the reality and what those trackers give you. There's actually a study that on purpose fed people in the lab. They were sleeping in the lab and they were sleeping with the trackers. And on purpose, the scientists fed them fake data. They told them that their sleep was actually worse than it really was. And the people that were fed bad data about their sleep, they were told they slept bad. They actually performed worse throughout the day in cognitive tasks, even though their real numbers, their real sleep was actually good. So more important than those technologies, than trackers and everything, it's to know yourself. how you feel about yourself on a daily basis is super important. So developing the self-awareness, I would say, is more important than any tracker that you can get. The thing is that, like you said, the fatigue, it is a silent risk, right? I still hear pilots saying in other platforms that, I don't need 8 hours of sleep. I can get away with a little bit with 6 hours, with 5.5 hours. I feel fine. But the research is clear, TC, about 99% of the world population needs the regular amount of sleep, which is 7.5 to 8 hours of quality sleep. Cognitive performance drops significantly when sleep is reduced. And we don't even feel the drop, right? That's the most part. Because if everybody felt bad, I sleep 6 hours, I don't feel so good, then I'll take measures and I'm going to be okay. The dangerous part is that the subjective symptoms are hard to detect. We're just terrible at noticing when our cognitive performance starts to degrade. So that's what makes fatigue a silent risk. And it's one of the reasons there's, I created an entire keynote on demand because people kept asking about this. So how do I mitigate fatigue? How do I notice what are the early signs? How do I realize when I'm fading, when I'm not at my best? So then I can do something about it.
Based on what you're saying, I'm remembering when I was in the last time that I did the hypobaric chamber, basically, to test the hypoxic situation and take notes of the way that I was feeling. That three relevant symptoms that I would recognize no matter what, so that even if I was feeling them in the airplane, I would recognize them and right away apply the checklist. And for me, they were like finger tinglings, blurry vision, and headache. Okay, I still have them. If something like this happens in today in the air, I'm gonna go gang load the regulators, descend, okay, full oxygen and go down. What are, if you need to give three physiological signals that the body gives, what would be?
For sure, I think the number one, the key, the easiest one to spot might be mind wandering. I guess the technical term would be cognitive lapses in more technical language. So attention lapses. So it's that small loss of focus that we get. So mind wandering is normal, right? It's a natural behavior from the brain. It's not always bad. Actually, it probably served a purpose historically. It prevented us from fixating on something and missing a threat around us in our environment. So this mind wandering, this constant scanning for threats, it's actually a very good thing. There's research now talking about how mind wandering is prime time for creative work. So if you're looking for a solution to your problem, executives trying to find, create solutions to dilemmas that they're facing in their organization, there's nothing like allowing yourself some mind wandering time. Go for a light exercise, a walk, in the shower, while driving. Those are the times we have the best ideas. But so yeah, so those cognitive lapses, I would say those are early sign. Think about it's nothing dramatic, but have you ever been in a situation where you're maybe in traffic, you're stopped at a red light, the light goes green, and instead of going right away, you still like take a second or two, you finish that thought that you had, and then you realize and get going, or maybe somebody honks behind you, and then you go. That's exactly what I'm talking about, right? That's a small cognitive lapse. Where you're in traffic, it might not be a big deal. When you're home writing an email, that's totally fine. But if you're in the cockpit, flying at that speed of sound, the consequences are greater, right? So that's an early sign. If you notice that you're reading NOTAMs 2 to 3 times and you're not understanding, that's another sign right there. Small cognitive lapses, your attention drifting. Um, yeah, mood swings as well. If you start noticing that you're lashing out on people that work with you, that you care for, people around you, you notice you're short on patience for no reason, those are probably the three telltales that you're not operating at your best. Mood swings, cognitive lapses, and the attention lapses.
That's great. This is a great takeaway because looking at your 11 insights, in the first block is the first block of three, which is basically the defining the threat picture. Okay, so you talked about the way that pressure reveals breakdown. You talked about mental fatigue. The next step you already talked about at the beginning is the basically that the pressure is really great at exposing preparation gaps. And, we go in the air, we record the head up display. So we have a film of what happened in the air, and then we come down. And what we learn, and this is a tool that, business should apply, and you will tell me more, but we basically, through the debriefing, we go through that film and we review it. And 99% of the times, if something went wrong, it was not because of the execution or the pressure. It was because in the briefing, there was not clarity. Something was not clear. And then, or we understood in a way, and then in the air, we were not able to execute. Does it happen also with your clients? Does it happen also with your work that things, um, people try to blame the pressure instead of blaming the preparation?
Sometimes, yeah, and especially with high performers, right? They true high performers, they got there, let's be honest, because they are accountable people, they're highly responsible, and they're great at what they do. So people who are highly accountable and responsible, whenever there is a mistake or a breakdown, they don't tend to blame others for their failures or for their mistakes, right? They take responsibility for it. Now, where they place the responsibility is sometimes where the issue is. It might not have been something that they did wrong on purpose. Maybe it's something they did before or they didn't even think about considering in order to mitigate that threat. So it does happen, but it depends, I find, mostly on the system, depends on the culture, how the training is delivered to them. All those things make an influence, right? How consistently that training is reinforced. Because if you just deliver training and let them on their own, then some people will engage with it, some people won't see the benefit and they will stop until they are actually in trouble. So the reinforcement, it's important. What I'm trying to say, this is not a one person's job, right? Every person within a team plays a role in shaping the culture of that team. And the culture is a very powerful driver of good behavior, of realizing what is it that we need to be fixed, what is it that needs to be worked on for next time. It's a constant exchange. People shape the culture, and on the other hand, the culture shapes the people and the behavior as well. So my job is I see it as, in a way to foster the culture through, my interventions, my everyday actions, the way that I communicate with the clients, the standards that I reinforce, the behaviors that I model myself as well, of course. The key is alignment. I teach what I teach has to match how I act. So my interventions have to support the culture that we're all trying to build. The ego thing, honestly, I notice more in sports than any other field, to be honest with you. And I hate to generalize, but it's just I'm talking my experience here. Male athletes tend to struggle with this a little bit more than female athletes. Female athletes often seem a little bit more open-minded or coachable in general. Not all men, of course, are not like that, but ego does show up sometimes with male athletes. It can get in the way of feedback, of learning, of being more adaptive, their own self-awareness, the team first decision making that we talked about earlier in terms of reducing ambiguity. So the way that I address this personally, when I work with any type of team, a sports team, an aviation, any high stakes environment, first I try to lead by example, right? So I pursue excellence myself. I bring receipts. I do my homework, right? I know my stuff. I try and try my best. I don't know everything. That's impossible. I'm fully aware of my shortcomings and what I need to improve. There's still a lot that I need to learn. I'm not perfect. But I work hard and I work smart and I'm a lifelong learner and I will never demand my clients to do something that I'm not willing to do myself. So the first step is to lead by example, demonstrate excellence myself, and that models the standards for the people that I'm working with. The second step would be get to know the people that you're working with. I try to get to know them beyond just their role. They're not just a player or a fighter pilot. My approach in my mission statement of my consulting business, I am athlete centered, pilot centered, student centered, person centered approach to everything that I do. So, what does that mean? Before they are a pilot, before they are an athlete, they are people. You know, they have hopes, they have dreams and aspirations and goals and buttons that can be pushed one way or another. And those things can derail their performance if you say something wrong, or they can also be extra motivating if you say the right thing. So those drivers are important to understand. I try to understand that uh, about the people that I work with. This is emotional intelligence. This is CRM, right? This is interpersonal skills. The way that I give feedback to people depends on what I think will be most effective to them. The language I use changes, the length of the feedback changes, the tone, the timing, the direction that we're going to go, the level of directness. All of that can be managed and tweaked and changed based on the person that's sitting in front of me. And it needs to be done that way. The more personalized, the better. So the goal is to get to know the people that you work with, and so that you can be more effective, telling them, directing them properly. Just it was on the news lately, like Artemis 2, like the crew of astronauts. You can tell right there a great example of this. They know each other so well. They know their families. They just collaborate at a level. The team cohesion there was so high. You can tell that if trouble happened while they were flying there, they would be able to work together to handle that situation just because of that cohesion. They know each other so well, right? So, and I guess number three would be to focus on the behavior, not the person. That's, I guess, basic advice, but a lot of people still make that mistake of labeling the person a certain way instead of labeling the behavior. I don't believe that one strategy works across all fields, but that's something that you could for sure say across aviation, across sports and everything. Don't blame the person. The language matters. Label the behavior. Make it not as non-personal as possible. So they don't feel as defensive, they can take it better. So I guess those would be my three tips or ways to get around that resistance, that ego.
Yes, what it comes out is that coaching, instructing, is so different from one individual to the other that it cannot be copy and paste. And in your work, being able to work from athletes, elite athletes, to elite performers, elite fighter pilots, and from different fields is really hard work. If you liked what you have seen, listened so far, hit the subscribe button if you have done it yet. Also, you're gonna find the link for the 11 Insight of Gustavo, and you're gonna find also the links for your work, for your site, to get in contact with Gustavo. For now, we have covered basically the first three insights. We were talking about the threat picture. Now let's move on. Now that we have named the threats, we need systems. So not intentions, it's not motivations, systems. In the cockpit, we use the cross scan. What is it? Basically, is a way to look at the screens in a pattern that is prioritizing the most important screen depending on the phase of flight. So there are four instruments, five instruments: the radar, the head-up display, the electronic warfare system, okay? And you scan through those. And nowadays, you were talking about already eye trackers to see scientifically the percentage of attention that people are throwing to certain screens. You never skip one, or you never linger on one, because this is the thing, you get target fixated. Now you're fixing only one, and that's when you hit the ground. In the next cluster of insight, okay, you live exactly here. So the insight number 4 is where attention goes, performance follows. Okay. And this is kind of the head-up display, basically. No, the screen the pilots have in front, they have all the information, they're following altitude, speed, and targeting information. You never look away from the five because all the information is there. Then if you have also an element mounted sight, you have also everything projected there. But let's stick to a simple part of avionic that I've described also in the arsenal of fighter pilots. The question is, what's on your HUD? What's on a head-up display? What are you choosing to project into your line of sight every day? Because we want to make a parallel for something that we have in the airplane, because whatever that is, that's what drives your decisions. So, Gustavo, how do your clients get this wrong, this projection?
I read a study recently. It was not from from a psychologist. It was actually from a historian. It made an interesting point because people tend to think nowadays, and it's in the media all over the place, they're saying that our attention span has actually been decreasing over time, right? I'm sure people have heard that before. But this historian compared data from the past few decades and actually found out that that's not true. Our attention span, it's pretty much intact over the past several years. The issue is that our brain's capacity, although it is intact, the world around us, the environment around us, it's getting really, really good at grabbing our attention. Think about the phone notifications, social media, this culture that forces people to be always on, constant communication, stimulation, the instant access to everything. Essentially, you never have time off before, you never have time off your phone. You can be at home, but you can get a ping and an email or something to respond to WhatsApp, a Slack message, right? So poor focus has essentially become a new habit. That's our standard. It's not because our brains atrophied or became worse. It's just a new way of operating, which is much worse. All that means is that it requires more deliberate training from people. The environment is more challenging, so we need to train our mind in order to face that challenge better. Attention is not broken, it's being constantly pulled, but focus is also trainable. In environments that I operate with, the people that I work with, stress is an added factor. Stressor is like a kryptonite for attention. It highly reduces attention. Under high stress, one of the biggest risks is cognitive tunneling, right? So the fixation, the gaze fixation that you mentioned earlier. Cognitive tunneling, it's something that grabs your attention, your mind fixates on it, you keep looking at it, staring at it for an extra few seconds, and then you lose awareness of the bigger picture, of the things around you. So you miss important information, important cues. An untrained mind can lock onto something at the expense of everything else. This can happen not only during acute stress, like startle responses that we see in pilot training, but also high pressure moments, prolonged chronic stress, fatigue can lead to that as well, even emotional overload. So it is not only about the sudden emergencies that people face, but chronic stress, if unmanaged over time, it can lead to this cognitive tunneling, cognitive lapses, worse decision making, less flexibility in their thinking, in the way that they adapt to that threat. And that's why mental training becomes so important. We can improve how the brain processes information under pressure. It's a huge breakthrough. So the goal is to reduce overactivation, reduce the how your brain responds to those threats, improve emotional regulation, free up resources essentially at the brain without getting too technical, but you reduce activation at the amygdala, the fear center of the brain, and you have more resources available for the prefrontal cortex, the thinking, problem solving part of the brain. That allows you to make better decisions under stress. In a nutshell, mental training helps you protect decision making under pressure that way, from a biology standpoint. Dysfunctional performance honestly happens sometimes. There are people that either they don't prepare for the situations. Doesn't happen as common, but it does happen. I mean, no judgment here. Not everybody wants to be a high performer, right? Depends on what field, what industry they're in. But what also I see a lot in the people that I work with is the pattern that people think that hard work beat everything. The person that believes that, I'll work while they sleep or I'll sleep when I'm dead kind of thing. Rest is sort of like a weakness or a vulnerability. More hours equals better performance. And that's not always that way. I'm convinced that whoever invented that 4 a.m. morning routine type of rules, they did that on purpose so that their competitors would underperform against them. That's my conspiracy theory right there. But seriously, statistically speaking, most people listening here, most people in the world are not the tiny 1% of the population that can perform optimally with little sleep. 99% of the world population needs 7.5 to 8 hours of sleep. Statistically speaking, I can prove we're not all that guy. People need to rest in order to perform well. We just went over the data, right? Cognitive performance drops with sleep deprivation, reaction time gets worse, decision making suffers. People often don't notice that decline, so it's important to develop the awareness to mitigate that as soon as possible.
If you think about the way that people are controlling their attention, okay, they're focusing on controlling their attention, but the reality is uh, they are not controlling their efforts. So if you think about fighter pilots, young guys flying BFM, basic fighter maneuvering, now all of a sudden they are like using the max reheat all the way, they're pulling NGs, and still they don't win the fight. How comes? You are trying hard. But John Boy told us about the Huda loop. Okay. Observe, orient, decide, and act. Who is winning is not the guy that is trying harder, is the guy that is quicker in this loop. So this thing really introduces something that in the modern culture is the grinding culture. Like executives that they don't rest, they are like not sleeping, and they're grinding, grinding, grinding. For what? This happens also to you, right? I mean, like your clients, how they can refocus, because they need to find a system to refocus, because otherwise the next thing you know is burnout.
In my mind, and I don't mean to say that I know all the answers, that I have all the answers, but in my mind, the answer is not just balance. That's a misconception that, you have to be 50-50 all the time and work-life balance or something like that. That's not the answer in my mind. Well, you have to be intentional with your planning and with your preparation. So be honest with yourself. Figure out not only what you want to achieve, but also what are you willing to sacrifice? And for how long are you willing to sacrifice that thing in order to achieve your goal, right? So if your goal is you want to be a millionaire. And what if I told you, okay, I can help you become a millionaire, but it's going to cost you, your health, your family, all of your friends. Would you still want to do it? Right? So there is a little bit of planning and preparation that might go along with it to see how far you're willing to go. Once you achieve that certain level of clarity, then things start to click. I have a quote that I like from Professor Scott Galloway. He says, "You can have it all, you just can't have it all at once." So I truly believe that you need to periodize your life the same way that athletes periodize their training. You know this, TC, you work with athletes. An Olympic cycle is 4 years, man. 4 years. You can't sprint hard for 4 years. Every athlete knows that, right? So there is a planning, preparation phase, there's a building stage, there is a time where they're going to be honing and tapering, and then they peak for a competition, and then the cycle start again next year, and it keeps building up until the end of the 4-year Olympic cycle. Executives should do that. You can't sustainably go hard all the time. So that, like you said, is the shortest road to burnout. So understand that a few weeks and a few months a year, you got to be at the office a little bit more, and that's fine. But make sure that you compensate at some point in time in the month, in the week, or in the year. You make time, not find time. You make time for other things that matter to you. Leisure, family, friends, etc. And you don't have to, take a bunch of vacations. 20 minutes a day. 20 minutes a day sometimes is enough. It doesn't have to be something major or big every time. Structure your month, your week, and your days so you have some room for rest and recovery. Otherwise, you will underperform. Everyone is different, and in my work, it's highly customized, depends on who I'm working with. But if you want a simple blanket rule of thumb, for some people that maybe have some flexibility, they just want guidance, I would say a triple one rule. 1 hour a day, 1 day a week, 1 week every 6 months without work. Just for yourself, mastery of something new, and disconnection. That's the goal, disconnecting from work.
I like what you talked about the balance, because it's something that you know it stands out to me a lot. And one of my coach, mentor, friend, Matteo, was speaking about the wheel of life, where you take a slice of the pie and you write down what is it, and if you are satisfied with it, let's say work, let's say sport, let's say, I don't know, sewing and knitting, I don't know, whatever
Mhm.
is your thing. And then you see if the wheel can be a round wheel, Because if it's not, then, imagine a wheel that is over, the noise that is going to make. So it's not really balanced, but it's really, is it spinning right? I mean, is it spinning, is my life rolling and smoothly, or it is like confused? This effectively introduce the next insight, because to do that, people need to have systems. And you don't rise to the level of your goals, but you fall to the level of your systems. In aviation, I've flown F-104, F-16, Typhoon, PC-21s, and all the times I would have to use a checklist where times were confused, where the situation got complicated. So checklist, structure, and preparation are fighter pilot non-negotiables. And under 9Gs, you need to have automatisms where you act like following this procedure and checklist. So you don't remember the intentions or the motivation at the moment. It's not an holistic approach. It's very structured. It's a system approach. How do you help someone to build a system that actually holds under pressure?
Well, that's exactly the tension that I find working across different industries, So aviators are the best at that. They already understand it. You don't need to explain it to them. They just get it. That's how it is. My challenge is to translate that common practice in systems thinking into other areas, into other fields where it's not as well developed. There's a lot that goes into a successful system, a lot of moving parts, but within individual work, my go-to first step would be start with the biological factors of performance. So that's your sleep, rest, diet, hydration, which is often overlooked, right? People talk about what they eat and how much to eat and the right things and the carbs and all that, the macros. Hydration is something that's often overlooked. And so from field to field, that's where the changes are, I notice in the systems. Athletes in their system, they never lack exercise, for example, right? That's what they do. They train. So the issue with them might be overtraining, or overtraining is rarely that. It's usually under recovering. But crashing on the couch after a hard training, hard practice is not always the best practice. So for athletes, that would be one thing that I would recommend, and I would start at least. It would be my starting point. With executives, it could be the lack of exercise. Aviators too, sometimes, to be honest. First responders that I work with, often they're fit, so exercise is not an issue for them. It's more like about shift work and the sleep disruption. So caffeine use, circadian rhythm, the clinical trauma that they're facing. I have workshops specifically about that because it is a big, big deal. It's a big problem. So those, again, biological factors, right? The things that change their body and affect then their performance. Like I mentioned earlier, one that catches people by surprise sometimes is dehydration. Just bringing it back to fighter pilots, the target audience here. Even if people are good with their diet and, for the most part, they know what they should eat and what they should not. But even 1% dehydration, if you're 1% dehydration, that means you're lightly thirsty, right? If you don't have a monitor with you, what does that mean, 1% dehydration? You're lightly thirsty. If you're starting to feel thirsty, you already have lower sustained attention. Okay, so your focus is already starting to get worse just from being thirsty. 2% dehydration, think about 2% is like feeling thirsty right after an exercise routine, after a workout. At that point, not only your attention is lower, but also your memory, so information retrieval gets affected. Psychomotor skills, gross motor skills, fine motor skills, they worsen. Imagine that for an athlete or a pilot, right? You definitely don't want that. The mood, your alertness. So if you think about the implications to CRM, to performance under pressure, this is so important. And let's take a step further. 3% dehydration. So that means you're parched. Your mouth is like dry, like your tongue is starting to lock. That's 3% dehydration, subjectively speaking. Okay. Specific to aviation, 3% dehydration means a 40% reduction on your G-force tolerance at 7 Gs. So if you were able to sustain 7 Gs force for 30 seconds, if you are that thirsty, now you can only last just about 10 seconds or so. It's such an easy intervention to change, and it's so effective. Drink water before you feel thirsty. Thirst is a lagging indicator. If you are thirsty, you're already behind, you're already dehydrated. So drink water. That's good. It's easy. It's step number one. You know the reason why fighter pilots have a resistance against hydrating, right?
You need to do
Because they
it.
want to avoid,
You
yeah,
need
they
to
want
go.
to avoid
Yes,
going to
yes,
the
yeah, for
back
sure, for
in the
sure, for
cockpit,
sure.
right? So, but I'm sure it's inconvenient, right? It can be something comfortable to do, but if everybody truly grasped how bad their performance is affected by dehydration, maybe not as much people would, be affected by that. They would care more a little bit about those small, tiny changes that can improve their performance.
It's really good because now we built cockpit systems really to face those threats that we talked about. We talked about the way that attention goes and how you focus on attention and not intensity. So you don't want to grind all the times, but you need to pace yourself in a way. And now you have created a system. You're following the system, and in the Aztec environments, performance is a function of a system, not really a moment, but there is a system that is working there. When you're flying Typhoon and you have the radar, the defensive suit, and then you have the data link and everything, you are managing a system that is working in a choral way. After 11 years, there must be a common thread from the environment where environmental variables where clients uh, they're consistently underestimating them. What are those?
Well, at the individual level, I would say the recovery environment, right? Most high performance, high ownership, responsibility, like they said, they will blame themselves first. They think it's lack of discipline, lack of focus, toughness, whatever. But often the issue is that their environment never lets them fully recover. They don't set up the environment to proper recover. So the poor sleep, the constant phone notifications, no decompression time, pressure to be always available, light exposure, noise exposure, all these things that we don't notice, they're preventing us from refilling our tank in order to perform better again. Cultures that reward that overextension erode attention, the decision making, and emotional control of their people. So performance doesn't break down because of the high pressure environment or the moment itself. It breaks down way before in the recovery environment that people overlook and they think they're okay and they're not strong enough, but their recovery is not strong enough to support them going back the next day at full capacity. So I would say that's the number one thing that I notice individually, the people's recovery environment. But the other thing is something that I touched on earlier, it's the high performance culture. High performance culture needs to be nurtured by leadership, set by leadership, nurtured by everyone, and it's a must. It's a must here. So, for example, talk about my clients, ITPS and ITTC, the International Test Pilot School in Canada. When pilots look around, when they're walking around the building, the hangar, who do they see? The CEO, Dave Loshi, former Royal Australian Air Force fighter pilot, test pilot, incredible aviator, wonderful leader, has communication skills, leadership skills, just incredible. Okay. Next to him, the founder, Giorgio Clementi, who you also know really well. Same thing, incredible aviator, test pilot, knowledgeable, entrepreneurial. By the way, both still to this day wearing the orange suit for work, still open to learning, leading from the front. Who else? Brandon Pierce, the VP of Tactical Training. The guy doesn't stop. Great leadership, gives me everything I need to do my job there, doesn't micromanage people under him, allow me to do, from anything that I wanted in terms of program delivery to the design to everything. Their engineering team is developing now cognitive training programs powered by AI and machine learning. It's just as cutting edge research as it gets. Multimodal biometrics with flight data. It's just incredible stuff. What Brandon's coming up there with the R&D team. Billy Flynn, you had him on the show too, like a Canadian legend, right? You listeners know him, F-35 developer. So I've learned so much whenever interaction with him. Why am I telling you this? When guys at ITPS, the pilots, the student pilots, when they look around and that's the people that they see, that's the culture there, that's who is leading, running the show, setting the standards, they behave as humble as they can. They take accountability for what they do. They're not going to step outside of this mold set by those guys, right? So that is just a high performance culture. My job essentially is made easier. It's just to advise the instructors, advise, support leadership, and with my interventions with the student pilots to make sure that we continue in fostering this culture where the actions of the pilots align with the culture. That's it.
That's a great culture. Obviously, they are highlighting. We greet obviously David, Giorgio, and Billy, all of them, because obviously they are listening to the show. Okay, but what you're talking about is something like in the community of fighter pilots is something they really take um, in a way that is life or death uh, threatening situation. What I want to say is every fighter mission has a combat radius. So combat radius means that that's the farther point that you can fly before you need to come back. You need to come back home. Otherwise, you don't make it. So, and that's based on fuel, based on other consideration. But if you push beyond the combat radius, you won't make it home. You cannot come back. So and high performance do this consistently. You were talking about recovery. People are grinding to a point that they cannot go back home. They fly past their combat radius on adrenaline or ego or whatever the deadlines, and then they're surprised when the engine flame outs and you on RTB, on return to base. So and this is an operational requirement for the next mission. You need to bring back that jet. It's not like it goes take off and then you eject like 100 miles from home. Gustavo, this is the introduction, obviously, of the third block. We talked about the threats, we talked about the system. Now we're talking about recovery, okay? Which is not like a retreat or something that comes like, okay, let's take a nap. It's a reinforcement. We touched this topic on season 1. And the idea of active recovery is something that I use with my athletes. It's really something that helps them not only physically but also the brain. And I want to go a little bit deeper today because we're talking about operational protocols here, and not just why recovery matters. You explained that, but how you built it into high tempo schedule. In this grinding schedule that people have when everything feels urgent. I was reading the other day priorities. No, the word in the 18th century was priority. So now we have made it plural, but I mean, in the military we call it the crew rest requirement. From the time that you leave work and then you are showing yourself on base again. This is not an option. This is something that is mandated. So, what's the equivalent prescription that you give to your clients, to executives, or to athletes?
In military aviation, that was a problem that I noticed right away, right? People, they work really hard and they're very open-minded. They're trying to learn as much as they can. And sometimes that gets in the way of their recovery. The first thing that goes, if they have any, if they need to study a little more, to prepare a little bit more, they take away like their sleep, their rest, right? And that can be a problem. So that's why I created this sort of phrase, and that's why I posted on LinkedIn that recovery isn't retreat, it's reinforcement. It actually helps your performance. Honestly, I wish I could just recommend people to take long vacations or something. You know what I mean? That would make my life much easier. But because of the nature of the clients that I work with, the constraints that we're forced to operate under, I like this idea of the minimum effective dose. Instead of that rule of thumb that I said that, if people can follow the 1 hour a day, etc., that I mentioned earlier, for an F-16 pilot in deployment, for maritime operations here in the east coast of Canada where I live, where people spend days, months on board at sea, there are no days off for them, right? For months at a time sometimes. For a busy C-suite executive, what I often recommend, it's something more doable, such as intentional downshifts in transitions. What does that look like? 2 to 5 minutes, sometimes 10 minutes micro break. Just that little practice done repeatedly throughout the day, in between efforts, in between meetings, in between phone calls, in between sorties or tasks that are demanding, they're taxing. The key here is that recovery doesn't mean stopping your life and changing something completely. It just means giving your nervous system a clear signal that it can come down before the next ramp up period again. So these peaks and valleys in activation, they're highly restorative. Instead of constantly being in overdrive, very highly activation, fight or flight mode, essentially. For example, before moving from one meeting to the next, before transitioning from work to home, I might have someone do a short reset. That means like step away from the screen, lower stimulation for a little while, take some slower exhales, a bit of breath work. Notice where the tension is showing up in your body. Ask yourself, what do I need to release before I walk into my family right now? What do I need to let go from that meeting into the next one? Right? So that sounds simple, but it's a powerful transition that most people don't do. They just go from one to the next commitment nonstop. And then they just carry residue of stress, of pressure from one commitment, from one task to the other one. You carry email to the dinner table. You bring work home. That's not good for your performance and for your personal life as well. You can't carry conflict and stress into your sleep, right? The cumulative stress adds up quickly and it takes a toll. So the minimum effective dose, it's not about a perfect recovery routine. It's not about taking time off or doing a lot less work. It's about inserting small recovery cues into the architecture of your day. 2 to 5 minutes, 10 minutes tops, micro breaks done repetitively throughout the day can start to protect your attention capacity. It protects your memory, your emotional regulation, and your decision making when you need most. Of course, when I work with someone directly, we have to customize that based on their workload, right? I just gave you a bunch of examples from different industries, but people's stress profile, their family life, their sleep routines, the performance context, all of that uh, plays a role in what I would recommend them. But the starting point is simple. Don't wait until you're past the tipping point of exhaustion to then think, okay, I need to recover, I need to rest right now. No, build tiny recovery steps and reps along the way before the system is fully depleted. That prevents the cumulative stress buildup and protects performance.
One of the insights of this block of recovery is the one that you like the most, I think. There is no human performance without well being. I'm thinking about, I'm going flying and I get all my flight gear checked. Everything is checked. The aircraft is checked. I mean, I'm taking in the air an airplane that is functioning. Why would you want to bring a human that is not functioning into the theater, into the high stake environment? I mean, this is something that, in practical terms, what does a minimum viable pre flight physical look like for a C suite executive?
Let's keep it simple. Not necessarily easy all the time. You need, to work at it a little bit, but definitely doable. Okay. So hydration, water before you feel thirsty, micro breaks in transition. So your nervous system reset, 8 hours in bed. So sleep, movement, either exercise, physical activity, going to the gym, or if you don't have time for that, movement throughout the day. Like sitting is the new smoking. Just walking alone increases the likelihood of creative ideas, of problem solving. I mentioned that earlier as well. It doesn't have to be a full workout, right? I was guilty of that because as a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, Canadian national champion, I competed at a decent level. I used to think that for me to get a workout, you need to work hard. Right? If I don't go to spend an hour and a half in the gym, what's the point? I might as well do nothing. As I grow older, as I become more mature, I start to understand that even a 15-minute walk over lunchtime or parking a little bit farther away from the building and taking that walk, it's much, much better than not doing anything at all, right? So movement, super important. Diet. Diet is literally the fuel for your brain and for your body, right? So the let's say five daily inputs would be sleep, hydration, movement, nutrition, and the nervous system reset, right? Without those, it's really difficult to have sustained high performance, and they're not that difficult to include. It's small changes that definitely make a difference. Those would be my non-negotiables. for a busy executive who doesn't have time to take an hour a day to exercise or to take a whole a week vacation every so many weeks or so. That's the executive version of the pre-flight physical. Let's put it this way. Before we talk about advanced performance, before we talk about high performance skills and tools, we need to ask, is the system actually ready to perform? What are the minimum requirements here? These are not wellness extras, it's performance infrastructure.
If you think about, going through the centrifuge and training for the 9G centrifuge, and you're there, they tell you how to breathe. There is a component of emotion and physiological regulation that really can be trained with your work effectively. So composure under pressure is really a trainable skill. This is one of your insight and not a personal trait. How does it work?
Well, I learned this in 2012, day one of my first master's degree. Mental skills are just like physical skills. They can be improved with practice. So, to improve your resilience against stress, to improve your focus, your attention, there are training drills, there are exercises that you can do that allow you to get better at it. And the more information you have about these things, the better. So, do you need to repeat a protocol for another week or two, or can you just move forward and go to the next part of training? So training needs to be progressive, right? So challenging someone too soon might lead to breakdown. It might you kill their confidence essentially and their motivation to change. They might start to think, oh, I can't do it if you push them too early. But if you don't challenge them enough, that leaves progress on the table. It wastes time, it wastes resources. So part of the process of optimization of training comes, for example, biofeedback. That's where biofeedback comes in very, very handy, right? Because you get very, very specific data individualized from people there. We get concrete data that tells us when to move forward, when to slow down, why not. But biofeedback is an optimizational tool. It's not something that's mandatory or required. The way I think about composure, for example, is that it has to be trained progressively, just like anything else. Isn't flight training progressive as well? You don't start on week one to teach somebody a flight weapons school. You don't start with BFM, right? You start with GH. There is a general handling phase, and then you keep going in the close formation first, and then you move on, and eventually towards the end, you start doing more difficult mission sets to put it all together. To train your composure, it will be the same thing, right? In week one, the goal maybe is just awareness. It's control under low pressure. I start by helping people, for example, just recognize the early signs of stress. How does their breath change when they're feeling more tense, more stressed out? Their muscle tension. Start to notice that, the proprioception of the body. That's the technical term. The speed of their thinking, when their thoughts start to rush, the irritability, the sense of urgency, the tunnel visioning, the impulse to react too quickly. All those things are happening and we don't even notice, right? So we need to develop that sensibility to it, this greater awareness. Then we build a simple first step, like a reset skill, something we can use in real time to slow down the system and regain control, regain choice. Now, moving forward by week, I don't know, week 10, week 12 of this composure training, the goal is it's not just to feel calm, it's to be effective under pressure, right? So now we're layering the skill into a realistic condition. So for an executive would be maybe a difficult conversation, letting go of somebody who's been in a company for a long time. So maybe we can role play that, try to anticipate people's responses. How is the leader going to react to that? How are they going to manage that in the moment? And then help them go past that conflict, the pressure, and everything that they need to do. The person is learning to notice the activation, to regulate, and to execute the task that they want under pressure, right? All at the same time. So the progression moves from noticing the state that they're in, learning how to regulate the state that they're in. How does that look like and feels like? And then perform in that state whenever they have to. I think the biggest mistake that people make is that they practice composure only when they're already overwhelmed. right? They don't do anything, they don't do anything about it. And then when it's like a big deal, big problems, like, oh, okay, I should do a breathing exercise. I should do this that I read somewhere that's good or something. By that point, it's too late. You have to build the skill when the stakes are low first. Then you gradually train under increased difficulty levels into higher load, just like the fighter pilot training analogy that I just made. And then eventually you're able to put it all together as a trained skill that you acquired over days, weeks, and months. But it has to be trained before the moment demands it, not just try to wing it on the spot.
Having different type of people in this show, you use the word composure in a slightly different way that the previous episode with Mario is using it as a leader in times of crisis. Why? Because composure is basically stabilizing the system. So if you are a leader and everybody is like, acting weird or acting,
Mhm.
frenzy, at this point, if you have composure, this is the moment that you are stabilizing the system and people now can get to their task and everything. So it goes only for, it goes also not only for an individual but also for the organization, this type of composure, and you get there with training. It's not something that you learn one day from the other. And we are at the end of the insights. Execution depends more on regulation than on motivation, and I have a great example here because in the fighter pilot world we use the throttle management. Not full max at a hit all the times. If you're doing this with the Typhoon, then the fuel rate is so high that you're going to be empty like before the flight is over. Okay. So optimal performance is not maximum output all the times. It's controlled output. Why? You need to be aware that is available. So that's your motivation. Having the afterburner, having the max heat, it's available for you and it's powerful. You can use it, but you cannot sustain it. Regulation is really throttle management. And so, how do you help somebody who has been running on motivation their entire life and now they don't see their goals they don't see achieving their goals anymore?
For example, in my clinical work, which is a very small part of my practice, but I still need to maintain 1 or 2 days a week of exclusively clinical patients. It's just a requirement for me to keep my clinical license. They do need motivation, right? They do need motivation as well because their readiness for change is not quite there yet. But when I wrote about that on LinkedIn, when I said that execution depends more on regulation than it does on motivation, I was more referring to the target audience here, the majority of the clients that I work with, which are high performers, right? So, because very often motivation with that population is already high. That's not part of the problem that they're facing. That's not what they're trying to solve. Regulation often is the problem. So when that is the case, and when that is framed in a way that, listen, this is the one variable that's standing in the way of your best performance. That's what's getting in the way of it for you. Then it gets easier to start addressing it, right? So the way that you frame it, people become more receptive to it if it's done a certain way. So just like the composure training I just shared, this regulation will improve progressively, right? It's not going to happen overnight. So I'm sure you've heard of the 10,000 hours rule, which is not really a scientific set rule, but it does tell us that mastery of a skill requires time. So, that sets the tone. Bringing that up to conversation sets the tone. Setbacks are to be expected, even anticipated and prepared for, right? With effective contingency plans. And then it takes deliberate practice and reflection to close the learning loop, the feedback loop, first during lower stakes situations, then in harder ones, and over time, it starts to become a new habit. So actual research on behavior change in neuroplasticity, the ability of the brain to change itself, to strengthen neural pathways, to learn new things, shows that it takes about 7 repetitions of a behavior for you to begin new neural wiring at the brain. And for behaviors to become automatic, it actually takes from weeks to 2 to 3 months for this behavior to become ingrained and second nature to you. So that's why I say composure, recovery, attention are all trainable capacities. We're not just talking about mindset here. We're building repetitions until the desired behaviors become easier to do, easier to access under pressure. And that's why a system is required, not only relying on willpower or motivation. The system needs to be there to support when the motivation wanes or the motivation changes. That's why I don't do only like keynotes or just like deliver training. There needs to be a design of the implementation to make it stick, to make the behavior stick over time. That is the case, for example, with ITPS. And with all that in mind, that's when the conversation becomes easier. The motivation is important, but once that is already high, what else is getting in the way? Maybe it's the regulation. Maybe it's something that you need to manage in order to allow this motivation to keep driving your performance forward. And how is the system going to support you with that when you cannot see that's happening, or when you're not ready to make that change?
Gustavo, we are at the end. 11 years, 11 missions, 11 missions debriefed. If you have to distill everything, the one insight that took the longest to earn and cost the most when ignored, which one is it?
I would say mental fatigue is a silent risk. Incredible data like the end of the day performance and next morning performances equals being legally drunk in terms of cognitive and motor performance. Studies that show that. There's a study by FAA, very recent, talking about emergency helicopter pilots. And, they do a 7-day on, 7-day off shift in the US. And they noticed that people's cognitive performance, those pilots' cognitive performance decreases typically around day 4 of a 7-day shift. Day 4 is the tipping point. And the most scary part, again, is that when you ask them how do they feel on day 4, 5, 6, and 7 of their shifts, they say, I feel fine. I feel fine. But the measurements, the cognitive performance in the tests is significantly reduced from day 4 all the way to day 7. So about half of their shifts, they're significantly underperforming just because of the cumulative fatigue of the first days of their shift. So the potential consequences of ignoring these things, how much it impairs cognitive performance, how much fatigue impairs cognitive performance, even after mild fatigue, and how we can't notice that ourselves very easily. An untrained mind cannot notice that very well. So it takes specific training and a fair amount of self-awareness to know when we're in a danger zone and when we're not. So usually we think we're fine when we're not, right? So that being a true silent killer, I think that's the most important thing, the main takeaway for me.
Every sortie we fly in this show comes back to the same principle. The cockpit teaches you that you cannot outrun your system. You can be the most talented pilot in the squadron, and I've seen them, but if the system isn't right, the mission is gonna fail. Gustavo has been building systems for 11 years. And the 11 inside are not just posters, they are an operational manual. Let's give some actionable, like we said before. For the listeners, pick one inside, just one. Run it for 12 weeks, trial it, brief it, execute it, and then after 12 weeks, debrief it. This is how fighter pilot would do to get better. This is how the high performers would do to get better. Gustavo, thank you for being at this show. People will book time definitely with you. The links are down there. Today we went through operational. We didn't go through theory. That was done in the first episode we did together. Today we just gave actionable points.
Thanks to you for the opportunity to once again share a bit about my work and my passion, non-technical skills, human factors, performance psychology. Honestly, that have shaped how I see the world, how I behave as a driver in traffic, as a father, as a husband, as a business owner, a consultant. I love every opportunity I get to bring people around to this idea that cognitive training and mental training is not only doable, it's actually easier than all the technical training that they're already doing. And it's so important, right? So thank you for once again giving me the space to share a bit about that.
Tools for the pilots, season 2, fly fast, stay sharp, keep sharpening your tools. To the next one. Ciao.